In this context, ruach, spirit, like neshama, breath, is something that we have in common with all animals. Genesis 6:17, Genesis 7:15. It simply means life principle, power to live, the power we share with all animals as long as God wills. In fact, Ecclesiastes 3:19-21 spells it out. They all have the same breath, ruach. For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, ruach. And man has no advantage over the beast. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and all turn to dust again. Take a text like Ecclesiastes 12, verse 7, which says, "The dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit, ruach, returns to God who gave it." Obviously, a text like this has nothing to do with one's immortal self being reunited with God at death. Quite the contrary. Look at the context. It simply means that at death, the human person formed from dust disintegrates, and God takes back his gift of life. Look also at Psalm 146, 3 and 4. If God should take back his spirit, ruach, declares Elihu in Job 34, 14 and 15, and gather to himself his breath, neshama, all flesh would perish together, and man would return to dust. Thirdly and finally, Genesis 2 verse 7 tells us that as created by God, man became, not received or acquired, but became a living soul. Yes, the word translated being in the Revised Standard Version is the very word nephesh, so often translated in the Old Testament versions, soul. Now notice that in Genesis, it is not said that man received or acquired a soul, not that God put into man's body a soul. The human being is seen here, as elsewhere in the Old Testament and throughout Scripture, as a unity, an indivisible self. Not a separable soul or self plus a body, but one thing. It is not said that we are separated at death into soul and body, but we are seen as a single creature animated by the breath of life. Klaus Westermann has recently authored an authoritative commentary on Genesis 1 to 11. It was translated in 1984. On page 207, Klaus Westermann explains, "This sentence is very important for the biblical understanding of humanity. A living soul is not put into one's body. The person as a living being is to be understood as a whole, and any idea that one is made up of body and soul is ruled out. It is not at all permissible to read into the sentence that something of the divine was given to humans at creation." Once again, what is said of human beings in Genesis 2 verse 7 is said elsewhere of animals. Genesis 2 verse 19. Whatever the man called every living creature, that is, every living nephesh or soul, that was its name. Similarly in Genesis 1 or 9, water creatures, land animals in general, are all called living souls. Once again, it's perfectly true that sometimes the word nephesh does also refer to the human personality. But again, it is never said to be immortal, and it never refers to a separate personal essence which survives death. In fact, when it comes to death, nephesh is used in two ways. First, often it's used simply of the whole person. Yes, the Bible often speaks of nepheshes dying or being killed or being dead. It's just that in English versions of the Old Testament, the word is not translated soul in such contexts. Here are some examples. Joshua took Makkedah on that day and smote it and its kings with the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed every person, nephesh, soul, in it. Similarly, Joshua 10 verse 30, Numbers 35 verse 30, and so on. Or Deuteronomy 19 verse 6, where nephesh is translated man in the RSV. Or Psalm 78 verse 50, where nephesh is translated them in the RSV. In Ezekiel 18, the Lord declares twice through his prophet, the soul that sins shall die. Soul, nephesh. In many passages, nephesh is actually translated body in the RSV and described as dead. Leviticus 21 verse 11, Numbers 6 verse 6, Haggai 2 verse 13. Even by itself, nephesh can mean dead person, dead animal, or corpse, as in Leviticus 21 verse 1, Numbers 5 verse 2. Actually, my nephesh, your nephesh, his nephesh, or their nephesh often simply means myself, yourself, himself, themselves. So it is in Psalm 16 verse 10. The authorized version had there my soul, but modern versions such as the RSV, the New International Version, and the Good News Bible all quite rightly simply translate me. Thou dost not give me up to the grave. Either the psalmist hopes to be preserved from death, or he expects resurrection. But there is absolutely no thought of some personal soul separating from his body and escaping at death. The other use of nephesh, when it comes to living and dying, is as a synonym for ruach or neshama. That is, life principle. In Genesis 1 verse 30, it is nephesh that is used for the breath of life. This is also the key to texts like Genesis 35 verse 18, 1 Kings 17 verses 21 to 22, 2 Chronicles 1 verse 11, or Job 27 verse 8. According to Leviticus 17 verses 11 and 14, the soul, nephesh, is in the blood. What leaves us at death, what God takes, is not a personal soul or spirit, but the gift of life itself, which for a time he has lent us. Read Genesis 6 verse 3, or Psalm 104 verses 24 to 30. The point is, like all living things, human beings are utterly dependent upon God for life. It has always been so, as the Garden of Eden account in Genesis 2 and 3 makes so very clear. After all, what was it that God deprived Adam and Eve of upon their disobedience to him? Why, it was the tree of life, the power to live forever, Genesis 3:22 to 24. In its place, God imposed death, Genesis 3 verse 3 and 19, precisely in order to remind us of what in our sinful rebellion, like that guilty pair, we are prone to forget, to remind us that we are not ourselves gods. When God takes away our breath, ruach, we die and return to our dust, Psalm 146. And it's for our good, because we're in God's image, we need to be reminded that without God we are lost. So far we've been concentrating on Old Testament teaching about spirit, soul and immortality. And our conclusion is the same as that of E. Earl Ellis. In his article on life in the authoritative New Bible Dictionary, page 735, Ellis writes, "Life is given to man as a psycho-somatic unity. It is the I which lives and which dies." So far we've been concentrating on the Old Testament. We must now turn to the New. Does the New Testament present anything different? No, we find here precisely the same pattern of teaching as we've already outlined. Here again is E. Earl Ellis. As in the Old Testament, man's life and being is a psycho-somatic unity. The Old Testament view continued. Yes, New Testament Greek does have words for immortal, immortality, and incorruption. But these words are never used to refer to the human soul or spirit. And wherever they are used of human beings, the reference is to what we will be, not what we are now. The texts are in Romans chapter 2 and 1 Corinthians 15. Listen to what Dr. Murray Harris has to say in his recent detailed study, Raised Immortal. These words never occur in connection with the soul or spirit. Whereas Plato saw immortality as the natural property of all human souls, the New Testament regards it as a conditional as well as a future possession. According to Paul, it is those who belong to Christ, not all who are in Adam, who at Christ's coming will be made alive by a resurrection transformation that issues in immortality. The concept of the immortality of the soul ill accords with the tenor of the New Testament teaching, and therefore the expression deserves no place in Christian terminology.